Welcome to Bobbing Along with Bob and Otto. Join us as we look back at the events of the previous week from a Buddhist perspective. Please note that Otto and I are here for entertainment purposes only. Our opinions are ours and ours alone, and we do not offer any financial, medical, or legal advice.
So how are you doing, Otto?
I just basically took it easy today. I'm, like I said, a little low energy, but tomorrow will be another day. I
got it just before we came on here. I got email from the other Brian saying that the video was out of sync. Was the video out of sync?
Yes, I was going to mention that to you. It did seem like the audio was out of sync with the video. I meant to tell you that. I tried watching it earlier, and it was very... I think the audio's all there, but it seems completely out of sync with the video, so it might need some further processing.
Interesting.
I've only seen it on Rumble, if it's posted anywhere else. But have you tried to watch it?
I edited it. So how?
Right, but I mean watch it on Rumble. I mean watch it on Rumble. Maybe it's because maybe Rumble is what's doing it. As it was my first thought. Because I tried watching it, it was coming out all distorted, and I'm like, well, it's probably just Rumble. They have a lot of issues sometimes. So I went back to it the next day, and it was like still not working well. So, and I did mean to mention that to you, that there was questions with the audio video syncing. It seemed basically that it was out of sync. Do you separate the soundtrack from the video?
I have two soundtracks. I have my soundtrack and the other soundtrack.
Oh.
So I
think the two soundtracks kind of overlap a little here and there, and seem to be out of sync with the video.
So interesting. But this morning I wrote Rush a long letter. Didn't mean to write him a long letter, but it turned out long. About this thing that I have of like, if I'm under stress, there's something inside my mind that just shuts down. Boom. There's been a video that we've been dealing with, that we've been doing a response video to, and I've listened to it. I'm listening to it the third time, and I keep on finding these chunks of the video that I have just not heard after two listens. I've listened to it twice, and I haven't heard.
Interesting. Isn't that I've noticed a similar thing with myself sometimes. It's very interesting. What do you notice that you can, to go back and like, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? And then I think of all the times I've just gone through it and not noticed. But the fact that we're noticing is very important.
See,
this is sort of like, I think Robert Anton Wilson talked a little about this when he talked about the Fnords, F-N-O-R-D. And that was one of the things he put into his novel, the Illuminatus novel. And it was in that story, all the teachers in the world at a certain age take these kids and they give them a post-hypnotic trance to never ever see the Fnord, F-N-O-R-D. Whenever they see the word Fnord, they would not see it. You can't see the Fnord. If you can't see the Fnord, I can't eat you. So whenever they would write like a news story or something in a book that they didn't want people to pay attention to, they would end the sentence with the word Fnord. And then they would immediately blank out whatever it was they had just read, the previous paragraph or whatever.
Wow, that's fascinating. So when I was
little... once in a while you see people use that word and you'll know what it means now. Fnord.
When I was young, much, much younger, and we got TV, where in Rhodesia we got TV later than a lot of other places. And then my family wasn't wealthy, so we got TV later than the other people.
Yeah, than the other people, yeah.
But there was a lot of talk then, I remember, around that time of TV and everything, about subliminal messaging and about whether you can trust TVs or if they're going to flash little things. And so I've been really interested in the idea of subliminal messaging, but I've never really considered blocking out other people's messaging. That's a sort of a whole new sort of area of exploration almost to become aware of. Is that these messages can be there, but you can be just not receiving the messages.
Yeah, and the people would want to block certain messages from you. Or have you block them consciously from you so that they're absorbed subconsciously. That, I think, was part of the Fenor thing.
Oh, really? I didn't pick that.
Well, you still read, I mean, you still watch that video, but part of you just consciously stopped watching, and yet the information was going in there somehow. So you've got some awareness of it, but you have blocked it out. But that doesn't mean it's not in there, and it can affect you all the same.
Mm-hmm.
Things that you're not conscious of can affect you if you're not careful. And that's part of, the path we're on is learning not to be controlled by these things. And the way we're not controlled by them is to see them for what they are. A lot of their power is dependent upon their secrecy. Secrecy secrecy is a source of great power.
So does that mean that if there is information in your brain that you are not aware of, that it has that unknown information has a power to control you? Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, I think information might be too strong a word, although certainly information, but I'm thinking more of general ideas, memes perhaps. Not so much control you, but to perhaps aid certain aspects of yourself to be more in charge than others, but also to shape your ideas about things in certain directions. Remember what Nietzsche said about assumptions. Nietzsche said, when we assume, we make an ass out of you and me. No, Nietzsche did not say that. But what Nietzsche said is that a will to a system is a will to dishonesty. And one of Nietzsche's points was that anytime we make an assumption, any axiom that we have, when with our basic thinking, whatever foundations we have for our thinking, if we do not examine it, we are philosophically dishonest and we're on very, very shaky ground. So one of Nietzsche's big points was, well, what we would call baby steps. He said that in order for us to know anything, we have to work very, very hard, a very, very long time, and it is very, very difficult for us to really know anything, because in order, again, to be philosophically honest, we have to examine every premise, every assumption. But every time we operate from a premise, if we haven't examined that premise, and of course, how the hell do you examine a premise? That's the whole point. It's the foundation. On what do you place a foundation? So this means Nietzsche's ideas make for extreme difficulty of thought. You have to be scrupulously self-examining. And this is part of the way our mind works. If we examine it and see things clearly, if we can comprehend what's going on, it removes a lot of power. But when things happen in the dark, you think, well, that's just me. I have to do this. My thoughts are going in this direction. But when you illuminate, if you'll pardon the expression, the mind, and you see what's actually happening, you can realize, oh, this has to do with this idea that I picked up as a 10-year-old or whatever. And it ain't necessarily the case, as the man said. So this means that, again, it gets back to us having power over our minds and not our minds having power over us. And the parts that have power over us are the parts that we're ignorant of. And so I wouldn't call that control necessarily, but we can be shaped by our ignorance, or we can be shaped by our knowledge and illumination. So that's how that works.
Sorry, we're shaped by knowledge and illumination.
Rather than shaped by our ignorance, we can be shaped by one or the other. When we're ignorant of our minds, of the things lurking there, then we're being shaped in darkness, and we have no idea what's happening, and we feel helpless. How can you have no control over things you can't see? But when you see what's happening, when we instead of have knowledge of our minds, illumination, when we throw light into these dark corners, then our knowledge will shape us rather than the darkness. Right now, a lot of our thoughts are being shaped and directed from darkness, which is that we are ignorant of what's in there. So ignorance and darkness shape our thoughts. Instead, we want knowledge, illumination, and hopefully wisdom. That comes with time. I'm still waiting, but yeah. So yeah, we want to be shaped by light, not dark.
So you said we can go and we can figure out that thought that we had when we were 10. But I'm listening to you and I'm thinking that there's another level, and that is also finding out the thought that can shape you right now in the moment with what's happening right here?
Yes, well, every thought is right here in the moment, even those thoughts that you learned a long time ago.
I see.
So every thought is right now, and that is one of the reasons why those thoughts that you might first have come across a long time ago don't necessarily have much power. And actually, when they're looked at, they're usually quite ridiculous. They might make a lot of sense to a 10-year-old.
Yes.
But once the light is thrown on them and a little bit of wisdom, and I've talked before about that, you've got to use that metaphor of members of your internal committee or aspects of your mind or whatever you want to say it. There are aspects of your mind that are thinking in those 10-year-old terms. And a coping mechanism that a 10-year-old has makes a lot of sense when you're 10. But, as I've said, we have to show that member of the committee, show that aspect of ourselves that this is no longer a course that will bring us the safety that we're looking for. Instead, we have to take another course that might seem scary, but it's okay because this will work better. And so, yeah, but it all does happen right now.
Right, yes.
It all does. If it didn't, we would be powerless. I mean, if we really, if when we thought about the past and we actually went back in the past and had to relive it physically, really again, I mean, there's no way we could cope with all of that and with the future. And I mean, there's a reason why we're embedded in the arrow of time. We can only handle life at 1 second per second. That's about the most I can handle. I really wouldn't want to handle more than that at this point. Maybe even a half a second per second. Slow it down a little for me.
So I've been really interested in reading Cosmic Trigger, the Robert Anton, that he talks with all these guys that you refer to as the committee members. He's labeled them. He's got like a scientist and a philosopher and a neuroscientist. He's got all these things, and he talks of himself as when he experiences things, he talks of this aspect of himself experiencing this aspect of himself, making an experiment to find out this thing.
Right.
And I think that's really fascinating the way he does it, because the word that he chooses to describe his committee member, like, just gives you a setting for understanding the mental attitude that he's in when he's approaching those concepts. It's as if by just labeling himself philosopher, when he says the philosopher looked at, so you just, in one word, you're instantly like slotted into his frame of reference.
Yeah, and that's a skillful, I think, use of the committee members. We're not going to get rid of them anytime soon. But it's simply a fact of life. There's times when he's writing and he's thinking in terms of a neuroscientist, other times as a philosopher, other times as a comedian, other times as a stoner or a rascally hippie, and always somebody that was willing to take pokes at orthodoxy, even the orthodoxy of what you would call the left. Especially Cosmic Trigger, the volume reading was, again, one of my first really important red pilling steps, where he was completely critical in that book, many aspects of the change, basically the neoliberals, the direction of the identity politics and things were going. So he talked about the bell curve and things like that, and he never moved away from that model agnosticism and being very, very, very clear about what he was talking about. But that is useful. I think I told you there was an exercise you can do, and I've done it. I've got to find that list where you sit and you make a list of all the different aspects of your personality. I remember I wrote this huge list, and I came across it like a couple of years later, and I'm like, oh, these are all my good band names. Pre-coffee grumpy boy, something like that. Things like that. That's one of my personas. Early morning Marxist, early morning fascist. It's like you just get all these. About time we overthrew the bourgeoisie and just completely put them all against the. Where's my cup? And then you put on different heads, or I talk sometimes about putting my my Buddhist head on or my king head. Depends on what you're talking about. But yeah, he's very, very clear about that. This actually is an interesting point. I remember thinking about this, but in Gurdjieff system, the Gurdjieff system has to do with recognizing that we are not one, we are many. And at least the goal of his system, as I understand it, is that you first create what he calls magnetic center. And magnetic center is basically you pick an interest and direction in your life, and then you get all of those aspects of your personality, all of those different eyes, he called them different eyes, that are interested in this and supportive of this. You group them all around the magnetic center. And the other eyes that don't fit, you just dismiss them, do away with them. It's very, of course, we've heard this before from the Buddha, where you encourage skillful qualities and discourage unskillful qualities. So Gurdjieff's idea was that first you start with this magnetic center, you have this group of eyes that are skillful, and then these eyes eventually become one big eye, the deputy steward. And then finally, the master can arrive when the mind is well disciplined enough, and you basically create one person. Crowley's idea, and this is where Wilson is coming out of, and Leary, they got a lot of their ideas from Aleister Crowley. Crowley's idea was that you have all of these different personalities, but rather than trying to unify them into one personality, you should experience each and every one of them. So Crowley would have all sorts of exercises about just taking on completely different qualities so that you were never really nailed down to any. I remember one of those exercises was something like you would have a ring. Say you've got like a ring, and if you put the ring on one finger, you would take on the character, and he said, support the Conservative Party, a vegetarian, a teetotaler, somebody who likes baseball, and then you put the ring on the other hand, and like you're a political liberal who's a meat eater and who likes a beer with his meal and hates baseball, loves basketball, and just two sets of it, and you just pick whatever qualities at random. He just gave a list, but the idea was the qualities should be completely opposite and odd and detached from the other, and that you just get into that. It's almost what they would call, I guess, method acting, the method where you just become that person. And of course, his idea that no matter what concept was presented to you, you would be able to argue both sides. You would walk completely around it and consider everything from one side or the other. And again, this reminds me of something Tanisra was saying about how when you have like a thought, you should think about it and say, well, where will this thought take you eventually? Walk around the thought, see all its implications. What if the opposite of this was true? What if it is true? And look at the ramifications. So I think Wilson, in that sense, is trying to develop the healthy aspects of his personality, give them a label, and it does help to clarify your thinking, because you're going to be looking at things differently. We've talked about this before. When you go into like a workplace, like if you were going into work at school, you have a different head on than if you're going into a store to order a cup of tea from someone. Then if you're going to stop and visit like your sister or something, you have a completely different set of communication standards. You're going to be speaking differently, different body language. You're going to be a different person. This is another person in your committee. So rather than trying to hide this fact, you should make each one as skillful as possible. Be a really good orderer of tea. When you go in there, you're going to be the best customer you can be, and go with everything else in your life, kind of deal. So.
Well, one of the interesting things it's interesting to me that I've mentioned before when we've talked and on other shows, I've also talked about how I was brought up in a quite conservative Christian environment. And there's a language around Christianity that's, it's about forgiveness and love and brotherly love and sacrificing yourself. Is this whole, way to discuss to communicate the concepts. And I'd found with the direction of my life that those words had stopped working for me. And I don't know how to explain that, but I was no longer being clued in to the sort of the narrative of society. I'd somehow fallen out of it. And when I encountered the whole Buddhist way of speaking, which was, for me, it's the concepts sounded so similar to the concepts that I'd grown up with, but the language to describe them was so different. Like, for instance, talking about skillfulness and unskillfulness instead of, for instance, sin. I suppose this is the main.
Yeah, sinful or unsinful, yeah, or
Yes,
virtuous,
yes,
or good
oh,
or bad,
yes,
even.
yes. It was just changing the word. I mean, and I've thought about it a great deal over the last few years, and it's really interesting to me how it was using a different set of words that started those sort of basic human instincts working again in me. I don't know if I've explained that properly. Just
I
interesting.
think so. You can get you can get into a blind alley sometimes with our language because we use these words, and when they can get overused.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that is one of my despairs when it comes to modern English, for example, is just the ubiquity of obscene language in our literature, in our media. Um, this really is something that takes all the strength from the words. You know, they just don't have any kind of real pep if everybody's saying them.
Mm-hmm.
And I told you the story of when I was with a group of 80 young men like myself, and we could cuss all we wanted. We were all in our late teens, so we were going to be manly men. After a while, one regular cuss word wasn't enough, so we were making compound cuss words, adding two and three and four together, and shooting them out with staccato, kind of, because really a good expletive should be short and sweet, kind of deal, and powerful. And I think that's some of the bird language I hear, especially when they, like a cat or something appears. The cardinal has this very, very interesting little alarm call, they call it, which is like, "Hey, hey," and it's like, I can almost imagine, coming around the corner and there's a jaguar, and I would just go, kind of deal. You have that same sort of thing. But so basically, you can go down a blind alley with language, and the words are just don't mean anything to you anymore. And the way you're describing your childhood, it's one thing to be told about, the beatific vision and the love of Christ and all this sort of thing, the descent of the Spirit, blah 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 blah. And it's really bad for somebody who's a natural mystic such as yourself, who's stuck with a bunch of people who can only mouth the words. And unfortunately, we no longer have in place, in the Middle Ages, you would have been safely put off in a nunnery of some sort where very well you might have been the next, Catherine of Siena or some other leading. There were several very leading women theologians. Again, this tends to get played down by people that, are uh, not aware of the nuances of medieval church history. But yeah, there was a place for mystics to go where you could meditate and pray and write, long theological tomes about all sorts of things. Not so much today. And most priests, I would think, are unprepared to deal with it for the most part. Mysticism, the churches have been so demystified. So, and another aspect of it is, again, it's like flogging a dead horse. Well, you're sinning. Sin is like this terrible thing, and there's mortal sins, and I mean, there's like levels of sin and everything, but still, after a while, you start noticing that there's no lightning bolts really hitting. And you're noticing, again, this gets back to that social consensus thing. You notice that the world laughs at most of this stuff. And as has been pointed out, the churches themselves don't even preach the seven deadly sins anymore. At the most, they might do something about lustfulness, but even now, that's gone out the window. And every single one of the seven deadly sins is an integral part of our capitalist system. So, you can't really discourage those things anymore in the church. But with Buddhism, and when we started talking about Buddhism, and, one of the first things I wanted to talk to you about was, not there's a judgment involved of yourself when you said I did something bad, that makes me bad. Whereas in Buddhism, it is the action that we look at, and that can be skillful or unskillful. It's sort of like Oscar Wilde, and one of my favorite quotes from him was that there's no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. A book is either well written or badly written. you know you're not good or bad, you of yourself, but your actions, because really you of yourself is just this very peripheral thing. But actions, they do speak louder than words, and the actions are the things that, well, we are the heirs of our actions, right? Determined by our actions, defined by our actions. And at the end of the day, our actions are what are driving us to whatever our destination happens to be. And we are so blind with these actions. So skillful and unskillful is really a good way to put it. Because when you tell someone, even if you tell them, well, you've done something bad, in our culture, it tends to stop everything. You stop thinking there. You just think bad. Okay, well, I must be punished and that'll fix it. And of course, as we talked about before, punishment doesn't fix anything for you, especially the punishments we heap on ourselves. It just becomes a kind of masochistic, vicious circle sort of deal. Buddhism wants to change the behavior, not use it as an excuse for punishment and control. And that's what I think a lot of these religions, and I'm not talking about the teachings of the original teachers, but the religious organizations. Again, these things, as Max Weber pointed out, and I often bring up, and any organization goes from having a charismatic, what he would call a charismatic organization, that is, the organization is based on the fact that these inspired teachers are living among the students. When you think of the early Sangha, you had the Buddha and you had Sariputta and you had Ananda and other really, really enlightened guys all kicking around. That must have been an amazing time, to be following the path. It's like, yeah. But then eventually you get to a point where it becomes, the people that are joining are not necessarily the brightest bulbs, but you still have to let them in because it's for everyone. But it's, people are going to have different needs. And then there's the organizational needs. And next thing you know, well, you've got to have a building and the taxes have to be paid and you need blankets for people and who's going to feed the monks. And so, yeah, you can't really blame the institutions that much because they're institutions. It's all they can do. It's all they can do. But part of that is perpetuating their power and control over people. Buddhism is about getting control over yourself. And a big part of that is not suddenly short-circuiting your inner dialogue by judging you. You're bad, So yeah, I found that too very, very useful. The dichotomy of skillful and unskillful versus good and evil or good and bad. That was, and this is, I think, a very basic part of how Buddhism can help liberate our minds by taking them out of these old dead ends and using these newer words. These newer words.
It's fascinating that you use that word dead end, because I've been thinking, while you've been talking, I've been thinking about metta and how you translate that as loving kindness. And I remember when I first came into sort of Western conversation, there was a lot of, I was involved in a lot of conversations where it was like, what's wrong with the word love? Why are we changing our word love? Here we've got this word love. This has worked fine for all our ancestors' time. And now here we are in 1970 or whatever it is, and we're on loving kindness. And yesterday, when I was looking through this really interesting list, Otto, it was a list of how long emotions last. And it was like they gave this list of emotions that last for half an hour, right? The shortest emotion.
Right.
So listen to them. Disgust, shame, humiliation, fear, compassion, and irritation.
Think of the laboratory. Think of the experiments to get this.
I know.
That would make a movie.
Interesting. And I mean,
well, Roberta, we're doing discuss today.
Yes,
Let's see how we can.
Yes, exactly.
All right, sit at this table. Oh, take the lid off this plate. Go.
Yes, you're going to be looking at a dead pig head that has got lots of worms crawling in the eyes.
Well, they wouldn't tell you ahead of time. Part of the disgust is being surprised.
The disgust would be surprised by it. It's just interesting. Okay, so quite apart from whether it's real or not, it's just interesting that researcher, whoever they are and whatever their thing,
their methodology was, I would like to look at their methodology very closely.
It may be absolute rubbish, but listen to the group of words that are meant to last so small. Disgust, shame, humiliation, fear, irritation, and compassion. Isn't that weird? I just find it so weird. And so I've been thinking about compassion being in that group. And I've been thinking about the idea of loving kindness or love and thinking about how problematic all those things are. And then coming back to the conversations where you talk about metta. Is that the way to say it?
Well, that's the way Panivasa says it, and he is my guide to the pronunciation of all things Pali, but I have heard it pronounced metta, metta, metta. you'd really have to talk to a Pali scholar. But the closest thing I have to that is our friend Panivasa. So he says metta, so I'm sticking with metta. You say a lot of things about that guy, but he is a stickler for detail, which is one of his strengths. Like all great men, he has that touch of autism in him, which insists upon correct pronunciation of things, and also completing any book he begins to read. So,
all right, yes. Well, that's something I need to work on. Let me try and finish this Robert Anton Wilson one. Okay, but let's talk a little bit about using different words and using non-English words to talk about concepts that we are sort of trying to understand and put into practice. Because this is another interesting thing that I've come across is this using words from a dead language. That's weird to me.
Yeah. Well, Pali, again, the sutras are written in Pali, which is a very old language, a foreign language to us. But one of the interesting aspects of this, and one of the problems, is that a lot of the translations that we have now, the standard translations in English, the people started doing the translations in the 19th century. So a lot of the terminology they use to translate these Pali words, and metta is a good example, have a slightly different meaning. And again, the meanings can shift without people being aware of it. Also, the emphasis on word shift. And metta was translated originally as loving kindness. Now, loving kindness is a hyphenated word usually. And I believe that the people who wrote that meant it to be kind to people in a loving way. In other words, your kindness should be a good kindness, an affectionate kindness. It didn't mean having affection for the people, which is an important point. And so, unfortunately, it's been taken to mean that you should love everybody. And there's that wonderful misquote of the Buddha about you should care for other people the way a mother cares for her child. No, the quote was actually that you should care for your capacity for metta, like a mother would care for a child. It's a very important distinction. Jean Punadamo suggested the translation of benevolent kindness, benevolent kindness or benevolent generosity or benevolent kindness. I'll have to get a hold of him and ask him exactly what, but I'll go back to that video because we had a little discussion about that in the Q&A. And of course, Sinisero uses the phrase goodwill, which is, that itself, I think, is a good way to translate metta, except at the same time, just the phrase goodwill has its own implications. The idea of benignant generosity or benign kindness might be an even better way to put it. But we have to be very careful when we're introducing religious or philosophical concepts from another culture into our culture and then coming up with an English word for it. Most of the time, in any kind of situation like philosophy, theology, any specialized study like this, we'll tend to use words and give them new meaning. Like Nietzsche using the word resentment, which he spelled in French, ressentiment, to refer not just to like regular resentment, but to a specific psychological state that he was describing. And this is the case with things like loving kindness. But again, I think actually the phrase loving kindness is sort of unfortunate because it's too much emphasis on the love aspect. And that's not really what it's about. As I understand it, metta is a good wishes, goodwill, the hope that the person that you're sending metta to will understand the causes of true happiness and be able to act on those so as to be able to attain their happiness. Basically, you want them to be happy. And it has been pointed out that if everybody were happy, then there'd be a whole lot less suffering in the world, And of course, there are people that we don't want to be happy, people that we dislike, people that we only have heard of on the internet 5 minutes previously. And suddenly it's like, that person should suffer and burn forever. Blah. Good thing we don't get our wishes. We all have a lot of really bad karma. Not that the thought is a good karma, but yeah, there's levels to that. So, but yeah, the translation of these words can be problematic, and not so much even the original translations, but just the way the translation itself is no longer as understandable, as reachable for modern readers. If you look at the Thomas Shelton translation of Don Quixote, And I'm not going to get into the Don Quixote authorship question, because there are some who argue that
No.
Shelton's English version that was actually predates, and the Spanish version was a translation of the English, was originally written in English. And there is some evidence for that. There are some words in the Spanish edition that do seem to be clumsy translations of the English words in the same, sentence, that actually work better in English. That it seemed to show like some ignorance of the English word on the part of the Spanish translator. But be that as it may, if you read Shelton's version of Don Quixote compared to a modern version, there's a huge difference, and the average modern reader will have a great deal of difficulty. One of our mutual friends was talking about his problems with Shakespeare because the language is so archaic. There's so many words there, you basically have to learn a whole new language. And that's why I've got my Shakespeare lexicon next to me whenever I pick up a copy of the plays. I have my lexicon right there next to me, and here's one of my joyous little one of the joyous aspects of technology. I've also got Wiktionary and online etymological dictionary, so I can dig deeper into some of these words. And I just love learning, new words in a new language. But for the average person, they really don't want to sit down and take a half an hour to read a page because they're checking every third word to see what it means. And this is not quite the case with some of these terms that the 19th century scholars and early 20th century scholars were using. But a word like love, and as you point out, the word love has gone through a lot of different changes. And it just a phrase like making love means something very different today than it meant, say, in 1920. You can watch these old movies and it would be just basically what we would consider flirting or pitching woo, sort of deal. The word gay, a lot of words can change very drastically. And sometimes, leading to very laughable, at least for us. So we have to be aware of these things. And I don't think it's a bad thing to tweak how we translate these terms. And of course, there is the argument that we should simply use the terms instead of saying loving kindness or, benevolent generosity or goodwill or whatever it is. We should just say metta. But even so, we need to explain what the concept means to ourselves. And so an English translation is still a very important thing. And the thing is, still, we are Anglophones, I believe is the modern term. We speak English, although, the English of you Commonwealth guys has all kinds of weird things. I think it's related to the fact that you drive your cars on the wrong side of the road. But,
that
but
English
yeah,
originate in the Commonwealth. You do. I don't want to be proprietary or anything, but.
But yeah, so no, we're speaking English, and we need to talk about Buddhism in English. And the Buddha never intended for Buddhism only to be taught in Pali, and wherever Buddhism has gone, it has brought Buddhism to people in their vernacular language at one point or another. Translating the suttas was always a big thing. There's stories of like Chinese monks traveling to India so that they could, get the right, see the purer suttas and bring them back and translate them into Chinese and things like that. So it's important that we have a really good vernacular Buddhist tradition, but that's going to mean close examination of the words. Now, there have been some attempts at this. John Tenisero, a few years ago, I'm not sure exactly how many, has done some major translation works. And he's actually, I think, made some interesting modifications to the language we use. Some of his translations, I'm not really qualified to speak on. Our mutual friend Panibasa has said that he feels some of his translations are idiosyncratic, but he also points out that Tenisero is a practicing meditator. He actually does the practice and understands it from within. So this gives him an edge that a translator like Bhikkhu Bodhi, for example, who is, whatever else you want to say about him, I've never heard any criticism of his abilities as a translator. He's an excellent Pali scholar, but he does not meditate. He's a scholar monk, not a meditator monk. And of course, there's a place for scholar monks, but ultimately they can never really understand the bones of the practice. So even though their translations may be beautiful examples of scholarship and insight, still they're going to lack that further insight and be able to bring that extra nuance into a translation. And I think that's one of Tanissaro's strengths. He's very much an American, but he's also been very, very, he for decades has been very much immersed in Buddhist culture. So he's able to kind of make a bridge between them. And I think this is true of a lot of the Westerners who have actually spent time as monks. We say this about Punadamo and Panabasa too, but Tanissaro, of course, has a very good reach with his Wat Meta setup.
So when you talk about these guys being monks, what they're really doing is they are joining, I was going to say a secret society, but it's not really secret, is it? But it is.
That's Mahayana stuff.
But it's got a sort of a secret language. I mean, not secret, but this.
It's a jargon. It's a technical jargon. Yeah. Unless you know it, you're an outsider. There is that. You need to be. It's like being initiated into the mysteries of, I don't know, a machine shop, knowing all the different terminology for like using a lathe and a drill and stuff like that, or a mill. So yeah, it's an apprenticeship program, as I understand it. I mean, that's one of the reasons why you have monks not just reading books, but living as monks so they can live this path and have older monks to guide them, people that know what to do. So yeah, it's very much an apprenticeship program, and I'm sure that they don't memorize the 200 and some odd Vinaya rules, overnight. This is something that you pick up with long usage and study and practice. So, but yeah, it is, you are living a part in a certain way, so that you can dedicate your time to the path. Full time.
Do you think that sort of immersive involvement in a community is what opens a person's eyes to understanding the nuance of the terms?
Well, I think the main thing about being immersed in the community, it has to do with the playground and playmates metaphor that you like to use. It is if you're very, very serious about the path and you're saying to yourself, something like, geez, I was in that last war, I sure killed a lot. I better really, I want a good rebirth. I better really start working on getting my head together because so you really, really want to intensively study and train. Very difficult to do that at home. Very difficult to do that, in a world full of samsara. So you need to be around people who are also practicing the Dhamma that will encourage you in these behaviors. They aren't going to say, oh, come on, have a beer. Come on, what the heck? You can do that tomorrow. Hey, look, the show's on. Come on, you don't want to miss Star Trek. Oh, oh, hey, that's some toga you got there, pal. Ha, ha, ha. You want to be with people that are going to reinforce those behaviors, reinforce those thoughts, and have more experienced people to guide you that you can turn to for advice. That was one of the important things about having admirable friends, having friends around you who will support you in the practice. And being in a community of people that are going to support you in the practice. And that also kind of gets into that thing that as humans, we do have that bit of program where we'd like to be part of a group. We've seen that lately where, 90% of people made a decision based on everybody else was doing it. Some of us still have critical thought, but even those of us with critical thought, we're still critically thinking, looking for something we can be part of. It's just something that has to come up to our standards. That's what I found with Buddhism.
Yes. So it's the combination of the behavior and the words together, and this, it's so fascinating.
Reinforcement of the environment. The environment's very important. Most things that we go through in life, it's like you're saying, you've got the words you're saying to yourself, you've got your mental fabrications, you've got your bodily fabrications, of course, but you've also got your environment is going to be a big factor in affecting all these things. And of course, the idea is that we can be independent of our environment. That's true. But there's no reason why we shouldn't use these training wheels if we can. And, without the training wheels, it's almost impossible to get started. It really is, So
you say fabrications. That's another interesting word. And then you've got becomings. What would you, if you had to choose the most important words, can you even do that? Is there a group of really important Buddhist words that is sort of foundational to the understanding of the teaching?
Well, metta is very important,
Yes.
Becomings are very central to how we understand our psychology. I believe the Pali for that is bhavana or bhavana. And it depends on what you're trying for. But I mean, I think the important words have to do with becomings, have to do with metta, with goodwill, which is very important to us, or benevolent kindness. The words that have to do with meditation, samadhi. Samadhi is a word I think is sometimes misunderstood, especially since occultists and magicians in the late 19th and early 20th century got a hold of the term. And I think I've talked before about how people like Aleister Crowley and his group, the AA, and before him, the Golden Dawn. You had, what's his name there, T.B. Randolph. A lot of these guys were dipping into Hindu and Buddhist texts, whatever was translated at the time. They would take the descriptions of yoga and meditation and kind of basically bastardize them, use a lot of the lingo. So words like samadhi and chakras and things like that were turning up. I think it's important to look at what the people who are writing about these things have originally meant. And it's important for us to try to understand the nuances as much as possible and produce an English word that can reflect those nuances. And a lot of our words do have a lot of nuance to them, but most people have lost those nuances. It's like when they talk about Buddhist virtues. Virtue, we put a moral spin on virtue. It tends to have a moral kind of coloring to it. Someone is virtuous, that means that they're morally or ethically good. But virtue really means power, or virtue is a property, the healing virtue of a plant. So when somebody is translating something about virtue in like 1890 or 1910, it's meant quite probably something very different. Or even if you were talking, no matter how we're using the word, there was still that implication to the word, which unfortunately is simply not there a lot of the time when people are talking about it now. I understand it and I see it, and you probably do too, but 99% of people are simply not going to get that. So virtue might not necessarily be the best word to translate that. So there are a few key words, but really it's our whole approach to translation, I think, needs to be really nuanced, because I do think it's important for us to have a good vernacular version of the important Buddhist writings. This has always been an important part of Buddhism, is getting the Dhamma to as many people as possible, writing it down, translating it, letting people know what's happening, and teaching the Dhamma, accordance with the Dhamma.
Yes, indeed. So you mentioned samadhi. Samadhi? What does that mean?
Concentration. It means concentration.
Concentration.
Crowley would use the term to refer to a specific mental state that you could attain through what he would regard as a mechanical process. He was one of those reverse engineering enlightenment guys. Well, if you just do this, this, and this, you'll have this chemical reaction in your brain, and that's what enlightenment is. I did it once, so now I understand all of it. And he's a busy guy. He had a lot to do. It's like, all right, somebody, woohoo, I'm there. Write a book about it now. All right, next thing. I think I'm going to try this new drug. Yeah, it's called mescaline. Whoa, I wonder what that'll do. Stuff like that. Yeah, he was an early mescaline guy. So yeah. But samadhi concentration. It's sitting in meditative concentration, I believe. Panibhasa, he could give a very exact definition, and if he listens to this, he doubtless will.
Okay, good. Excellent. So I just would like to ask a question about that. In the Eightfold Path, mindfulness is the 7th, and then concentration is the 8th. Is that
right samadhi? Yeah.
Is that?
Yep, right concentration, yeah. So that's translating the word samadhi.
Right. So so I see. So right concentration can be translated as samadhi.
Yep.
So do all those other things
samadhi is translated as concentration. They all lead to right concentration.
Right. Do all those other words of the Eightfold Path also have special names?
Oh yeah, they're all in Pali. I don't have it right in front of me, but in fact, probably Wikipedia has like a list of all the different Buddhist terms in the original Pali and talk about how they're translated.
Yes.
So yeah, each term has a specific English translation, and each one, like I say, there are ways to look at them in a more nuanced way, or at least we should take our nuanced understanding of them and get our translation to reflect that. would be really good, and I've been thinking about getting this, is getting someone who knows a bit more, or actually a great deal more Pali than me. Getting Panibasa on to talk about some of these words, maybe Punadamo too. They have worked together before, and they both have some interesting ideas on translation. And I think they're both also aware of the importance of presenting Buddhist ideas in a way that people will understand, not just the way some 19th century scholar decided to translate it.
Yes, sure.
So,
can I ask you another thing about that? It would be fascinating to talk to them. It would be so interesting. But what if people don't understand the English words? Like you talk benevolence, right? Benevolence is a
right.
very, very high level English word that has got a huge conceptual aura that surrounds it. You know, it's sort of got this idea of giving without expecting anything back, which is a different idea from the idea of goodwill, which means sort of like a heart thing. You're offering
Yeah.
a happy sort of feeling of goodness to. So if there
Yeah.
are people who don't even understand the English nuance, how do you explain the Buddhist nuance?
You quite probably won't. The path for everyone. We're not here to dumb down the Dhamma to the point where, everyone can get it. This is not a mass movement. That's why you don't see Buddhists going door to door trying to get people to join. You have to be ready for it. You have to have the karma for it. I mean, I like the idea of changing translations because I want things to be made more clear to people so that they can understand it. A lot of the reason why were things that kept me from Buddhism was some of the translations and presentation of Buddhist ideas, which I now know were completely wrong, or at least off center. When I was told for years that the Buddha taught that all is suffering. No, he never said all is suffering. He said there's suffering. This is what you do about it. He actually, you read, yeah, surely there's pleasures. There's all kinds of really nice things, but do they last? And let's look at them. He never denied their existence, but he's trying to show you a more skillful way of thinking about them.
Yes.
But that's not how it was. And that I would have been very interested in listening to and reading about, but not this. What do you mean all is suffering? I disprove that by having a shot of whiskey. There, I'm not suffering. This is pretty good.
Done. Yeah.
Yeah. So they're done. The Buddha is refuted. With wild turkey, 101. That was my drink. So. Yeah, so I think it's important to have clarity with these words, but yeah, if you don't have a good enough English vocabulary to understand them, then I suggest you go and learn English and have a decent vocabulary. But no, we're not here to dumb down the Dhamma, and I mean, if you did, it wouldn't be the Dhamma anymore, unless you're at a certain point to be able to understand these things. They're simply not. There's no simplified version of this stuff because it's not a simple path. But again, it's a completely voluntary one. That's the other half of it. Nobody's going out trying to get anyone to do it. There's no Buddhist press gangs out there. Come on, you're going to be a monk. What? I don't want to be a monk. Shut up. Shave his head. Put the toga on him. All right, buddy. Start meditating right away. You're going to be enlightened or else. We're dragging you kicking and screaming to nirvana. It's like, whoa. No, it's not like that. So yeah, for those people, they're probably just not going to be able to understand it, at least in this life.
Right. So it's a real voluntary participation in this sort of sense-making game. Yeah, interesting. So fabrications, Otto. Okay, I'm sorry, I know that's not a Pali word. I don't know enough Pali words
That's
to
okay.
ask.
I don't remember the Pali word. Like I say, this is why it would be good to have Panubasa here to spew out the Pali.
Yes, I would.
Yeah. But yeah,
But what is it? Sorry, we don't use that word much in English, to fabricate. That's sort of like
we don't. It's an old word. Again, this is one of those 19th, early 20th century translation terms. It's an excellent word, though.
Yes.
And it means what it means. I do like fabrication. I think that's a good word, especially since it isn't in as much common usage anymore. So people don't have misconceptions about what it means. So they will accept accept the definition that you give them. They don't have preconceptions about it, like a word like, for example, virtue. So yeah, fabrications are things we fabricate, things that we are at cause over, that we make, that we create, like our verbal fabrications, how we talk to ourselves. And that, as I said earlier, I deal with that by creating new verbal fabrications, skillful ones that I use to consciously replace the ones that are unskillful. I'm also really good, or not really good, but I've gotten better over the years at catching very unskillful verbal fabrications. I catch myself saying things to myself that are very negative, and I'm like, hey, what the heck is that? Where did that come from? I'm not listening to that. So there's that, and of course, mental fabrications, how we frame things, how we look at things, the mental tags we put on things. The tags we put on ourselves. I'm a victim. I'm a loser. Or it could be I'm a victor. I'm a winner. Or I'm a meditator. Whatever you want to, or I'm a drunk. Whatever. So that's something you fabricate, and of course, the breath, which is unconscious and conscious at the same time. That's the interface between the volitional and the non-volitional. And again, that's something that we can fabricate, how we breathe. So something we do. So fabrication has to do with things that we do, things ultimately under our control, if we will but seize control. If we will but seize control.
We will but seize control. How interesting. I'm thinking of that little saying, the map is not the territory. And I'm thinking that if the word is the map, then the territory is maybe these sort of conversations that people have, and like you suggest, talking to Panabasa or Ajahn Punadamo and bringing all this sort of joint knowledge together into a conversation, and then we leave that conversation, and the map that we have of the conversation is maybe the word, like you explained samadhi to me. Now I see it. I've got this little word, but now I see a much bigger.
Yeah, well, you see, what I would say is the words are the map, but so is all the combination of words you put together. You're getting a bigger and bigger map that's more detailed and shows you the things you can do, the possibilities. The words are the map. The territory is, and we can't give it a name. That's
Yes.
how Zen masters, what is reality? Hit a gong, clap your hands. There's no, and it's interesting because you just said the words are the map. So what is the territory? Well, we can't talk about it because we're the words. But you can build beautiful maps and better maps and skillful maps.
But we do have things like when you're talking, I'm thinking. So I'm adding, mind you, I suppose I don't know, it's big.
You're experiencing something you can't talk about because the words are the map. But we both can look at each other and know that we're in the territory, but
Right.
all we can do is look at each other and smile or maybe hit a gong. We can't talk about it because the more you talk about it, the further away you push it. No tongue has uttered it. No lips have soiled it. It cannot be spoken. Neti, neti.
Yes. Yes. Is this why you say that translation is so important? Because you get the right words, and then around that word, you try to build common knowledge and
Yeah,
interaction
yeah.
between people.
You need the best map you can get for people because we can't communicate with just hand claps and thoughtful stares. In the Zen school, they talk about the transmission of Zen. And of course, they trace the Zen teaching all the way back to the Buddha. With the usual Mahayanist thing, it's like, well, the world wasn't ready, but the Buddha said, keep this secret for 800 years, and then you can tell everybody, kind of deal. But in the Zen tradition, when the Buddha passed on his teaching, he did it by, as I recall, twirling a flower by its stem in his hand and smiling. And but we're not communicating like that. We need words. So the more accurate the words we can make, the words that give us the most understanding allow us to build the maps we need to get to the place where we don't need the maps anymore. So yeah, that's why I think translation is very important, and that's why translating a word into something like skillful and skillful can make such a huge impact because it brings with it so many aspects of a new way of looking at things that other translations simply wouldn't do.
Gosh. Wow. Well, it would be absolutely fascinating to talk to translators that have had that experience of wrestling with words. It would be so
Yeah, yeah.
hear their point of view.
Well, I know I think we could get Panyabasa. He has, of course, translated the Akavaga, and he's done some translations, although it's not his main forte. But he would have a lot more insight on this, and he has a much wider knowledge of, the original translations of the Pali Canon, so he could talk more about the different terms that were in use and possible alternate terms that could help, a Westerner have an easier grasp. You don't want to make things too easy, but you don't want to cloud things either. That's the thing.
Gosh, Otto, what a fascinating conversation. Thank you. Thank you for all that amazing insight and information. I mean, I know you're so humble. You always say you don't know a lot, but wow, you know so much, so much. So thank you so much for your time and your insight and for being here with us today. It was absolutely fantastic. And with any luck, maybe we'll be able to go on with this conversation and explore new avenues. So thank you very much for today.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure as always.
All right. Okay, so thank you also for listening. Awesome to have you with us here today. And yeah, we'll see you again next week. For today, it's goodbye.
Thank you for listening to Bobbing Along with bobdub. If you enjoy content like this, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Or better yet, come and join us on minds.com/bobdub. If you're not already a member on Minds, get a free account on this open source social media platform. We look forward to seeing you next week for another episode of Bobbing Along with Bob. And if you can't wait a week, you can find older shows here on this channel. Goodbye, everyone.
Bobbing, bobbing along, bobbing along.